So in this blogcast, I'd like to look at extra-biblical evidence that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And the first point I'd like to make is that there are many historians, some of them writing within 2 decades of Jesus' death on the cross, that record the fact that he existed, that he was put to death in Jerusalem. In fact, some of those writers actually record the earthquake and the darkening of the sun. Most of those historical writers were hostile to Christianity, but they still prove the fact that Jesus existed and he walked this earth. And so we start with the historians, the evidence that Christ actually existed, was executed in Jerusalem. So we already considered the historians of that time, and they document the fact that Jesus lived and was executed by Rome in Jerusalem, and they documented some of the miraculous earthquakes and things that occurred, but that doesn't prove that he's God. So let me suggest something else now. On the day Jesus died, he had 12 disciples. One of them had already betrayed him and would soon take his own life, and the other 11 ran away scared. These guys were ordinary men, fishermen, one was a tax collector, some were zealots, not very well educated men at all, and certainly men who hadn't traveled very far except maybe from their hometown in Israel to Jerusalem and back. And then a few short weeks after his death, as Jesus promised, the Holy Spirit visited them and filled them. And suddenly these 11 men became giants of the Christian faith. They traveled throughout most of the known world, India, Iraq, Iran, southern Spain, northern Africa. They traveled around the known world spreading the faith and suddenly became wildly successful, and churches were planted all around, even the unbelievable into Rome itself. The change in the disciples' lives proves to me that Jesus Christ is the Son of God who supernaturally drove these men to good works they could have never done on their own. So we've just considered the supernatural change in the lives of the disciples, but now I'd like you to also consider the supernatural spread of the Christian church. We know that Rome conquered much of the known world and ruled over it for centuries. And during that time, many pagan cultures came against Rome, and many pagan religions splashed up upon their shores, so to speak, with very little impact on Rome itself. But now, Christianity is birthed in an already conquered Jewish country in a backwater of the Roman Empire. And yet 17 years after the death of Christ, we see Rome passing legislation to get rid of all the Christians in Rome. They don't like them, they refuse to worship the emperor, and they want their influence out of there. They're making a bigger splash than any other faith system they've ever conquered. This is huge, and it proves that the church's spread was driven supernaturally and could have only been based on the actual truth of the Son of God driving that. The next evidence that Jesus is God and directs his church supernaturally, I'd like to call the evidence that the church is self-correcting. Today around the world, the Christian church is known for building orphanages and hospitals and schools for both boys and girls. But if we were to go back in time, we would see a different history, a dark period of history in the time of the church. Basically from the time Constantine declared Christianity to be the religion of state for the Holy Roman Empire, the Roman Catholic Church was Christianity in Western civilization, clear until over 1,000 years later when the Reformation took place. And during those dark and feudal times, the church also became feudal, and the Catholic Church had its own armies, and they sought to pull knights together from all of Europe and launch crusades to retake the Holy Land from the folks who already occupied it. And by all accounts, atrocities were committed by those Christian armies. a bad time in church history. How did the church regather itself, push away from that heritage, and step into a time of enlightenment where they suddenly became the champions, passing child labor laws and requiring lifeboats on ships and all kinds of different causes? How did that happen except that Jesus Christ, the head of the church, reinstituted the actual gospel message, which has never changed, and people were convicted by the Holy Spirit within the church to say no to that legacy and to step into the life of loving the world the way Christ compels us to love. In 2010, there was a poll that measured how many believers there were in the various religious systems in the world. 31% of the world, 2.2 billion people, identified as Christians. Maybe the greatest proof that Jesus is God is the testimony of the believers for the last 2,000 years. Through every generation, believers have lived for Jesus and died for Jesus. Some have died martyrs' deaths, but most have lived out a normal life, believing in Jesus and finding provision and wisdom and love and forgiveness and the grace of God, all of the good things of the faith. A cult might be able to manipulate a handful of people into believing something ridiculous, but 2 billion people can't be manipulated into believing something unless it's true and unless it's driven by the Son of God himself, Jesus Christ. That's what we believe, and that's the most powerful evidence that he is who he says he is, and he continues to be that today. For those of us who believe in, there's always room for someone else who discovers a living relationship with the living God, Jesus Christ.